Take a second to think about how much your life depends on the internet. In that second that just elapsed, over 9.7 terabytes of data were exchanged around the world. This is nearly 3 million emails, 9,000 tweets, and over 80,000 YouTube videos. Today, more than 4 billion people around the world use the internet. In the next 3 years, nearly 2/3 of the global population will be online. To build more inclusive, open, stable, free, and prosperous societies of tomorrow, we need to close the gap between people who shape the future of the internet today.
Hello and welcome to the Closing the Knowledge Gap panel. So we're going to talk about this information and knowledge gap. And paradoxically, there's never been as much information and knowledge, and it's never been as easy to access information and knowledge through digital means. So why do we have such a knowledge gap on cyber and digital issues? And one of the answers is information and knowledge about cyber issues is diffused and shared among many stakeholders. Cyberspace is global, but the cyber resources, the connectivity, the expertise are not uniformly distributed across the world. And also with the digital revolution, cyber issues are everywhere. So everything is sort of becoming a cyber issue. The result is, if we want relevant policy making, we need a comprehensive, a global, and an interdisciplinary approach. So how can we address this knowledge gap? And I'm going to ask each of the participants to maybe give a 5 to 8 minute introduction about how to address this gap, what can be done, and what is actually done within their respective institutions. The first speaker is Nayia Barmpaliou. She's the head of public policy and initiatives at the Center for Cybersecurity at the World Economic Forum. So, Nayia, if you would like to start.
Thank you, Frederick, and a warm thank you to the organizers, EU Cyber Direct and the Belgian Ministry of Foreign Affairs for putting this impressive week of dialogues on cyber and digital. It's quite good to be able to be with you even by distance. And I would start before jumping into more potential solutions, maybe outlining where is the challenge when we are seeing the knowledge gap between government, private sector, and research community. And I think one of what I have experienced coming from a very, myself, from a very legal background that then shifted into development, international cooperation, and eventually cyber, I never saw it as a technical issue. So I started off for more than a decade in a very kind of policy level issue. However, that is not what has happened with cyber, and the fact that it grew out from the technical background actually made it also very difficult even for governments to approach it in the traditional way we're dealing with global risks, like the case of terrorism, weapons of mass destruction, and the like, where we know we're working together to identify adversaries' techniques and the like. So cyber has been an outlier, probably precisely because it came out as a technical discipline rather than a public policy issue. And that already makes it very difficult to connect the dots even within existing silos, I would say, within a government or within the private sector or within the research community. So we have these knowledge gaps that they are not only across sectors, but also within sectors. And the reason for that is also quite precisely because it's a multifaceted issue. So we don't have a coherent community. And even though there's been quite a lot of progress in the past 5 years to bring some of these gaps, in terms of the engagement that would then lead into a positive feedback loop also in closing the knowledge gap. It hasn't really managed to shape in such a comprehensive way. And to an extent, it's because of human nature. So there is a lot of vested interests and kind of forces to keep the existing silos, because it's nice to be with your friends and even adversaries, but like those that you know. Rather than try to bring in fresh eyes and fresh perspectives from different parts. If you are more from a policy perspective or a legal, to bring someone that has more of a technological background. And I think that's where also there has been, maybe the private sector hasn't had such a strong interest in engaging more broadly until most recently. I would say with some initiatives such as the Paris Call and others that actually put the private sector led alliances a bit more to the forefront. On the one hand, because we have the ICT leaders, the cybersecurity companies, platform providers at the forefront of defining the cybersecurity solutions, both with a priority in protecting customers. So there has always been the issue of regulatory interest as their number one priority, or liability issues and the broader risk from a more enterprise perspective on the one hand. And on the other hand, you have very much the other force of lack of incentives for security by design in digital innovation. And that goes across the board. I'm not talking so much about the big cybersecurity corporate players, but I'm talking more about anyone doing digital innovation. So we really still continuously see the imbalance of time to market and the time to security. And that already shapes a certain dynamic in the ecosystem that accentuates further the knowledge gaps. I think finally the research piece is very important, and we see that obviously cybersecurity is highly dependent on research and development, and we not always see the links between the competitors' marketability and all that when we're saying in terms of where are the investments in universities and research institutes that are not always necessarily having more of a public policy perspective. That said, I would say even though I'm a pessimist by nature, I'm an optimist by choice. So that brings me to be more of a pragmatist on a daily basis. Somewhere in the middle, I think that's where we have opportunities to break the silos. And in the silos, I mean more our current, I would say, global architecture is not fit for purpose for this. So we really have to think of what is an operating model that we need would actually help us and enable better knowledge connections and what we would call in the forum positive feedback loops. So what we are doing in one policy area and how that the governments are dealing with some of the very sexy themes, I would say, but they have not really brought much results. As we, the discussion at the multilateral forum, the international security, it has been going on for many, many years. On the other side, very things that they are at the forefront of the here and now on from an enterprise perspective, on cybersecurity ecosystem perspective, such as liability issues, cyber insurance, and the like. We're not really getting that prominent role in the discussion, and they're all important. And I think that's the problem of that. You have already different perspectives on what is the problem or what are the issues between government, private sector, research community, even a civil society. And then within those, you have this other, at times, competing interests on what is the most important thing in cyber. That is one of the aspects I think that can help us is really to obviously learn from other disciplines. And I'm not reinventing the wheel here, but even in an area of strategic competition and, you know, the calls for strategic autonomy, we've seen that in other dimensions of, let's say, you know, satellite positioning and the like, even strategic competitors have actually found a way to leverage technology to overcome those concerns. And we've seen very much how that the technological innovation can actually help overcome some of these barriers and kind of like overcome also the knowledge gap by, you know, the use of multi-party computation and homomorphic encryption, for example. That's the one piece. And the other obviously is the human factor, and I would say the geographical gap within all these existing gaps in terms of the global south. What are we doing in terms in alleviating the skills gap, not necessarily only on, like, you know, the famous 3 million cybersecurity professionals that we don't have, but really on also on the policy making in the aspects of even corporate responsibility. How do boards understand this, not only in Washington and in Brussels, but in Addis Abeba, and in Delhi and anywhere. So I think the ecosystem approach, how can we actually foster local ecosystems, national, regional, that can actually bridge these gaps and try to create these more, I would say, balanced and even if less, maybe not coherent, but certainly more inclusive type of dialogue. So now I'll stop here by saying that there are opportunities there from leveraging technology, from leveraging existing communities that you need to just cross-fertilize. And then more broadly, indeed, we need to rethink about our operating system. Is it fit for purpose? Because if it's not fit for purpose in 2020, it will only get worse, as we are seeing, you know, quantum computing and the like, actually making it even more complex to deal with cyber issues. So I'll close here, and I'm looking forward to listening to the rest and joining the discussion.
Thank you so much, Nayia. And maybe after we hear all the speakers, you can maybe come back to the initiatives or lead that the World Economic Forum can have to help the situation. Our next speaker is Hilde Hardeman, and she's the head of the Service for Foreign Policy Instruments at the European Commission.
Thank you very much, and good morning. All my thanks to the Belgian Ministry of Foreign Affairs and to the EU Institute for Security Studies for organizing this discussion. I would like to address two specific issues. First, the importance of policymakers and the research community working together for evidence-based policy making. And then second, and from my perspective, most importantly, how to build partnerships and influence decision-making in countries across the globe. President von der Leyen has pledged to lead a geopolitical commission, further reinforcing the EU's role as an international actor and further strengthening the rules-based global multilateral order are key. And so is leading the twin digital and green transition in this changing world. The EU believes in a digital future in which affordable and safe digital technologies are within reach for everyone across the globe in full respect of the rule of law and human rights, and where digital technologies are used to reduce inequalities, bring people together, and enhance international peace and security. Working in an evidence-based way and building strategic partnerships is crucial in promoting the EU's approach to digital cooperation. How do we do that? When it comes to building our work on evidence at EU level, before the Commission proposes any new initiatives, it consults interested parties. It listens to groups of experts who give advice on technical issues. And then within the strategic vision, the strategic objectives that the EU has set, the Commission tries to formulate its regulatory proposals in such a way as to take account of the inputs from research and technical experts, as well as from other stakeholders. If we look at how we build partnerships, with its emphasis on human rights and the rule of law, the European model is an inspiration for many. We hear from many partners that they are very interested in seeing what we do and how we do it. And the European Union has a toolbox with different instruments to build strategic partnerships with third countries. We have diplomacy, we can use regulation, we can use the research that we conduct or sponsor, and we have also our financial instruments. And that is the area where the service that I lead is active in. So through a mix of policy support, research and outreach activities, coupled with peer-to-peer knowledge sharing, the international digital cooperation projects that my service develops and puts into practice seek to influence policy making in partner countries and to build alliances with them. Strengthening networks with think tanks and academia complements official dialogues and provides policymakers with advice and a network of expertise. This contributes to the adoption of focused long-term visions in digital policies and also increases mutual understanding to find common approaches with a view to developing international norms and standards. Now, let me give you one concrete example, and that one concrete example is the EU Cyber Direct project, which is actually the framework in which this conference today takes place. Together with the EU Institute for Security Studies and with the European University Institute School of Transnational Governance, we have established what we call the European Cyber Diplomacy Dialogue. This platform aims to support the efforts of the European Union and its member states in conducting strategic cyber engagements with other countries and stakeholders in Asia Pacific, the Americas, Africa. This platform is also the perfect setting for regular exchanges between policymakers and scholars to bridge the existing knowledge gaps, share approaches, and address specific policy challenges. This project also allows us to engage with actors that may have fewer opportunities to come into the discussion. For example, last year, the EU-funded engagement support mechanism facilitated the participation of over 30 representatives from the Global South in the discussions of the open-ended working group at the United Nations to address the issues of responsible behavior in cyberspace. In short, such partnerships are really crucial to address the challenges of the digital world in a way that is in line with the values and the principles that the EU stands for, and in a way that bridges the knowledge gap. So those are the elements that I wanted to contribute, and of course I'll be very happy to engage in further discussion. Thank you so much.
I'm sorry, I forgot to turn on my microphone. Thank you so much, Hilde, for your contribution. And we'll move right away to our next speaker, Ruhiya, who is a Senior Program Officer at the International Development Research Center of Canada, but who is actually based in Amman.
Hi, thank you. Thanks to the organizers for inviting me to be on this panel so I can talk with passion about the work of IDRC. I'm just going to talk about three main things. One is I'm going to give you a brief introduction to the International Development Research Center, because I think it'll help you understand how we work to close knowledge gaps. I want to frame our thinking around the governance of cyberspace in the Global South. And I want to talk about a specific initiative which we support, which is around cyber policy think tanks. So first, IDRC exists through a parliamentary allocation from the Canadian government We do have an arm's distance relationship with the government, but we're part of the international aid envelope of Canada. We also do have external partnerships with other funders, including the UK Aid. And most recently, we're working with the Swedish International Development Agency on an artificial intelligence for development project. But our niche is really research for development. So that is research as it feeds into policy and practice, not just, so not research for research's sake, but rather for policy. And in our 50 years, we're 50 years old today, this year, excuse me, we've built a lot of local institutional research to policy capacity over long periods of time. So it allows institutions to become go-to trusted institutions for evidence. I work in technology and innovation, and the thing that we try to do in my program area is really stay out ahead of emerging technologies to understand and unpack the challenges and the opportunities for people and governments in the global south. So this is something, for instance, we're doing on AI right now, is like forging new territory. But critically, what we really do is we listen to the grantees and the partners who we've worked with over longer periods of time to find out what's happening on the ground, what policy opportunities exist, what's happening on the horizon, and to work together with them to develop research that can feed into evidence systems that are needed. So we have a lot of influential programming. We worked on openness, open development for over 10 years. We have a whole digital rights portfolio around privacy and information controls. I spearhead a portfolio of work on gender equality online. And so here's my second key thing, which is our framing around cyberspace and governance in the global south. Because it's really about advancing a nuanced understanding of the challenges of internet governance and supporting those evidence-based solutions. But really the whole idea of the global north and global south is highly problematic because not only is there a lot of movement of scholars, but actually the boundaries in cyberspace is complicated. So what we do know though, is that governments and organizations and users in the global south are really in the receiving end of influences from the north, and yet they don't have a lot of voice in negotiating policies. And this raises a lot of interlocking challenges. On the one hand, I think the video at the very beginning showed us, half the world's population doesn't actually access the internet. And most of those people are the poor in the so-called global south. And actually it's about 80% in some parts of sub-Saharan Africa. On the other hand, access to the internet, it poses a lot of policy and security challenges, as many people have mentioned. And the way that we frame this is the challenge between governments, civil society, and the private sector. And each of those sets of actors have a different stake in the territory, from human rights, online or digital rights, to cybersecurity, to innovation. Civil society, we are the holders of human rights. Those rights extend online. And actually digital tools have been critical for helping people to organize, to bring accountability and transparency, to document abuses. At the same time, these liberating tools are providing unprecedented opportunities for surveillance, tracking, and data gathering. And without really any agreement, tacit or explicit, from users. As Ron Debert from the Citizen Lab at U of T, University of Toronto, says, social media is really the same as surveillance capitalism these days. On the other hand, rights to privacy, digital rights, free expression, privacy, can conflict with the state's ability to curb hate speech or violent speech or gender-based violence online. So that's the state's ability to, the duty to protect and the power to surveil is a constant tension in democratic societies. And I think it's more fraught even now as the world seems to be, some parts of the world seem to be retreating from democratic norms. So these complex facets of cybersecurity impacts individuals, the state, and the private sector, and it's quite fragmented. So this is my third part, which is this is the foundation of the Cyber Policy Think Tank Initiative, which is really about providing locally driven research and a base of evidence that brings together these different disciplines and interests from overlapping areas and silos, as Nayia said, and allow researchers to grapple with the nuances and the trade-offs among the variety of cyber policy issues, telecommunications and infrastructure, economics and technology and law and social sciences. In order to, and also sometimes, you know, these actors from organizations in the Global South are also called on to do capacity building with their own policymakers and with their own civil societies. So we need these institutions to be incubators for new research and innovation, and to network with other organizations across the Global South who are also grappling with issues, but from slightly different perspectives, in order to generate sound policy ideas. So in 2017, IDRC held an open call for proposals from research organizations that are currently working on at least one of these sets of issues, to then expand their capacities and work and thinking and scholarship into one or two of the other areas. So if they were working on economic innovation, to really expand and look into cybersecurity or cyber policy issues, or to look into digital rights, because actually what happens is an advancement in one often leads to an undermining in the other. And so you have to find a kind of nuanced balance. So 6 centers were selected, 2 each from Latin America, from Asia, and from Sub-Saharan Africa. One of those actually was Research ICT Africa. I was one of the first recipients who actually is working with Patrick on this work. And it's actually the Cyber Policy Center, or the Cyber Policy Think Tanks, has really allowed some scholars to participate in these conversations that are happening in the Global North, or with the EU or elsewhere. IDRC is currently supporting 5 of the centers. We're about 2.5 years into the pilot and seeding organizations to expand their work and their core expertise. And it does seem that they're stretching into these new areas and really bringing their scholarship to bear and expanding their influence in their countries and in their regions and across the regions. And our hope is that they will continue to become and deepen as the go-to institutions recognized for their expertise, and also to become more sustainable, right? Because right now so much development funding is really for sort of short-term project funding. And I mean, research needs to be funded everywhere, but even more so in the Global South, where, you know, research institutions don't always have like good access to good research funding. It's not just on some one niche area, but they rather need a kind of expanded amount to allow them to stretch into these new areas. And what I've seen is at least this work has really provided like a foundation for the AI4D policy work. So I will end there, but I'm happy to discuss more and to share ideas. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Ruhiya. And we'll turn to our last speaker, who is Fabrizio Tassinari. He is the Executive Director of the School of Transnational Governance at the European University Institute in Italy.
Thank you, Frederick, and kudos to the EU ISS and the Foreign Ministry for putting together this majestic event. I'm going to try to follow as much as possible. I have been asked to provide the view of academia, or from academia. So when it comes to teaching and training, not exclusively about cyber and the internet governance, even though that is a constitutive part of what we do. But we are called a School of Transnational Governance, which is a rather broad term. So what I would like to offer is 3 basic points, or rather 3 gaps that would need to be closed, or perhaps before and in order to close them, they would need to be minded. So mind the gap before closing the gap. And the 3 gaps are a normative gap, a second one, which is a capacity gap, and a third one, which, in lack of a better word, is a cognitive gap, if you like. Now, on the normative gap, I think this is more obvious in a case of like ours, where we call ourselves transnational. But of course, it comes very much in focus when we teach, train, discuss issues related to internet governance and digital governance, which is to say that we take for granted certain assumptions about openness and about free flow of information and access to information that sometimes are not for granted at all. And I think you know, we as a school, as a new school, we set it up 3 years ago. We are very much aware that the moment in which we try to reach out beyond, for example, Europe, which we take as a sort of laboratory of transnational governance, some of the issues that we take for granted are not for granted at all. And then there are, in a way, two risks there. One is what constructivist scholars would call the actor-analyst bias. I mean, we take for granted certain things and we assume that they are just like that for everybody. And the second problem is that we somehow don't take for granted, or do take for granted, the failures of transnational governance and the spoilers to transnational governance. So the example that I would like to offer here about how we are addressing this in this sphere of digital governance is precisely, like Hilde mentioned before, the Cyber Direct project to which our school contributes, and it contributes particularly with one yearly event in Florence with all of the cyber ambassadors, and it is a wonder to observe how they indeed discuss these issues in a very open-minded way, and precisely not taking for granted some of these assumptions. The second gap that I would like to underscore is the one that I call capacity gap, and I guess this seems a little obvious. Of course, there is a need for building capacity. There is a need for improving knowledge and improving education. But I would like to take it perhaps a step back or deeper. And this is, I found the best example of this in the work by Daniel Markovits, who wrote this book about meritocracy. I don't know if you've come across it. But one of his points, which I guess could be seen as rather provocative, is that the consultancy revolution since the 80s and the 90s led to, well, not only a hollowing out of the middle class, if you like, in terms of inequality and so on, but a hollowing out of middle management and the mid-level, mid-career officials. And I think this is a very important point when you want to build the backbone of any organization, whether it is in the private sector or in the public sector, about a middle management that has got institutional memory, and that has got, if you like, even loyalty. I could continue, but the point is, closing the gap for a school like ours is really, I would say, about capacity, yes, but it's also a very Weberian mission. It is about building authority and autonomy of whether it is the middle management in a bureaucracy or in private sector or in civil society, to really sort of build the backbone of these organizations. And an example, a very concrete example I would like to bring there, is something that our school just launched a couple of weeks ago. It's called the European Digital Media Observatory. This is something that we are partnering, or the leading partner, and it is supported by the European Commission to really, yes, combat fake news, but it's also about media literacy and building this backbone that I was talking about before. The third gap that I would like to highlight is a cognitive one, and I suppose, again, also this is quite obvious to anyone that works in public policy. I mean, often you realize that civil servants, academics, private sector, when they talk together, often they don't talk the same language, and they don't speak with the same vocabulary, and they don't use the same words. And I guess each of us on this panel are involved in an exercise of improving this. From our side, and this is something that I want to flag, but I would also welcome recommendations and suggestions. We are trying to look at meta training or issues that can improve this cognitive or maybe epistemological, I don't know how to call it, the way we speak to each other. So we're doing things in behavioral approaches to policymaking. We're doing things, of course, on evidence-based policymaking, on how to conduct transnational negotiations. But the point, as much as dealing with the individual issue areas, is really to bridge this gap in the way we talk with each other. And we do this also via concrete case studies as a way to really try to tackle this. So I wanted to simply present these three very basic arguments: a normative gap, a capacity gap, and a cognitive gap. And I suppose this is just to throw some food for thought and open up for further questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I have many questions. I'm just going to ask one following up on your last argument, Fabrizio, because the feeling I have is not just a problem of the way we speak to each other, but I think there is a much more profound cultural clash between these different communities that are involved in those issues. If you talk, for example, just between the academia, the private sector, the government, but also the technical versus non-technical community, it's often not just the problem of the language, it's also the problem of the interests and the way of seeing problems, with academia being in a much more mid to long-term perspective and trying to see ahead strategically, and sometimes talking with the private sector where it's much more difficult because they tend to want results or return on investment much more quickly. And governments at the same time want the strategic vision, but also operational decisions rather rapidly. So how can we address this cultural clash? And maybe all the speakers have an opinion on this. Who would like to start?
I mean, I don't know, maybe I spoke about it just a minute ago, so maybe the others can intervene first. My point that I would like to make from our side is, of course, it is a responsibility on all sides. It cannot be, there has to be a desire to actually bridge this gap. And of course, there has to be a possibility to create platform where that conversation takes place. We have indeed, the Cyber Direct project in its iteration in Florence is precisely one of those platforms, because it gets these actors around the table in a safe space to discuss these issues. I'm not claiming to have an answer for this, but clearly what I'm saying is that it is an issue of responsibility above all for more concerned.
If I may jump on this, Frederick,
Sure.
as we're working at the intersection of public-private cooperation, which is at the DNA of the World Economic Forum, I'll give more of a practical example. We have one flagship initiative, Partnership Against Cybercrime, which really looks into the existing gaps and barriers for better, more sustainable and more scalable public-private cooperation in cybercrime investigations globally. And one of the key things that came out repeatedly is the fact it's not so much the language, but indeed the motivation and understanding each other's strategic interests, and then accepting those, and then seeing where there is an opportunity to actually act, and how you would then operationalize that. And I think there is not always appropriate available fora for that, unless you define the problem very narrowly or according to a challenge. And for us, the forum is definitely not known to be an implementer, but what we usually try to do is bring the different stakeholders together, identify what is a big systemic challenge, and then see what are if there are ways and if there is motivation to go around and address those barriers, either from a trust building exercise, which on cyber is very difficult, and also it's very time consuming, even when it's possible, or by using other technological means, or accepting the fact that some things will not be solved. But I think that the challenge on the language is something that we've been hearing for almost a decade, and I think it is. I deal with it a lot, even on my daily work, because I work with CISOs, are some of my colleagues, chief information information security officers and the like. And actually, I think if we stop seeing it and framing it as a problem and see it as an opportunity, can actually open up a bit the discourse, because if the framing of the different language already starts with a very defensive, oh, you know, you don't know what you're talking about, and you know what I'm talking about, and I think that's where we need those connections and events like this, the Roundtable. I think opportunity is also linking to one of the questions that I have put forward in relation to the research programs that actually enable that public-private discussion, even if before it becomes a cooperation. And I think that's where initiatives like the Horizon 2020 funds for some of the pilot projects that the EU did are some good examples. We have examples. We haven't really, let's say, maybe, you know, haven't done the methodology around the DNA of the good examples to be able then to scale them.
Thank you very much. So we have a couple of questions coming from the audience, so I will stop asking questions myself. We have a first question to Nayia, actually. So this morning, Commissioner Gabriel spoke of the need for a more efficient transfer from universities and research institutes to commercial marketable solutions. So from your experience, what are the best mechanisms to close that gap in the cyber domain?
I'll try to be very brief, because it's actually not an area that I have personal expertise, but I have been exposed to it. Obviously, we've seen, you know, we have several obstacles in the innovation pipeline and hampering that transition of high quality research into commercially viable products. And I think identifying what are the barriers is one way. Where, you know, I would say, you know, there is possibly lack of focus in existing research efforts on cybersecurity innovation. The collaboration that we mentioned between industry and research is rather weak. And then, especially in most places, the access to capital to support innovation is limited. I think what we need to do is indeed look at the good examples of I would say, two leading examples is the US and Israel in this, and what they've done and what are the things that they are doing. We worked on one big program of work we had at the forum called Incentivizing Responsible and Secure Innovation, a framework for entrepreneurs and investors, precisely on cyber-specific research, but more on digital innovation research, how you can actually make sure that during all the phases of R&D, you incorporate cyber. And I think that's still a cultural change. And I hope with, I think in many regions, you would still need a lot of government support to this in terms of funding. And in some others, there is opportunity for, more of bottom-up effort in doing that. I would be thinking more of the cases of some countries in Africa and Asia.
Thank you very much. Does anybody else want to react? Or I just move to the next question, which is actually for Ruhiya. So what would be your advice for organizations willing to establish closer cooperation with organizations in the Global South? What are the preconditions for such cooperation to materialize?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think first of all, it's to realize that there are public interest research institutions in the Global South doing excellent work. And sometimes that's not always realized, and sometimes in the Global North. And I would say, so it depends, I'm not exactly sure who is asking the question. So it sort of depends on your position actually and who you are. And if you're, if you're academia or you're, a funder or whatever, but, find ways to collaborate and sources of funding too. I mean, so that it's not just like a one-off. Like, if you really want the research to make a difference, I mean, find out what the policy window is and look at some ways that you could collaborate together on finding a source of funding for that, and figure out how that research then can come to bear on a policy process, whether that's an international policy process, whether it's a regional policy process or a national policy process. And, so find those windows and I mean, it's not that complicated. I think another thing to realize though is sometimes, I mean, some of the people that we work at, I mean, they are working tirelessly and constantly to have these issues raised to the surface. I mean, you know, even talking about basic access and connectivity is just a tireless project for so many people in the global south. And sometimes, you know, even like being on an online forum like this, it can be really difficult. I mean, I was trying to have a conversation with one of the grantees and it kept dropping off. So, you know, don't always assume that you're on the same footing. You know, even in, you know, these incredibly sophisticated places, they still have problems with connectivity. So, you know, and to recognize that. And, you know, IDRC funds a lot of public interest research, but, you know, also see how you can contribute to that. So I don't know if that's helpful.
Thank you very much. And just to follow up on this question, there's also an issue. We've talked a lot about bridging the gap between the different communities, but when it comes to the private sector in cyber diplomacy, we often run into the same actors, the same private companies. So is there any thoughts about incentives to or help to bring companies from the global south or even from Europe? Because very often we have the big players internationally, but it's very few companies. Anyone? Ruhiya, do you want to start?
Sure. You know, IDRC tries to work with the private sector as much as we can. It's not, you know, sometimes it's a tension over the interests, I think. I mean, that's, you know, I'm not probably the best person to talk about it, but like, you know, when your driving interest is in money making versus the driving interest of public interest, you know, you have to understand those tensions and to recognize them at the outset. But, you know, the private sector is doing the most innovative work. So in terms of bringing in the global south, again, it's about going out there and recognizing who they are and finding them and identifying them and getting out of your normal cast of characters. It's a fast moving space too. We regularly support mapping exercises. So for instance, I've just supported a mapping exercise of the AI ecosystem in the Middle East and North Africa in order to identify who the people are who are working in these areas. So it's important to understand who the players are. Yeah.
Thank you. Anyone else wants to jump in or, yeah, Nayia?
Maybe a quick reaction is, as we've seen the development of local ecosystems that I referenced earlier, and there are some initiatives, for example, supported by the European Union as the European Cyber Valleys. There are some initiatives, obviously in the US quite extensively, in Singapore, and some countries also in Africa. And I think considering that it would be quite a topical and opportune way to address the skills gap if you link it also with creating like local solutions in terms of services, because at the end of the day, you know, what we've seen, and it's a very interesting report by Cyber last year, where they're mapping the whole cyber market in Australia, that the most companies and government authorities are actually looking to external non-Australian, let's say, solutions, be it software, hardware, services. And I think that is an opportunity that clearly, if you link it with a national strategy on skills development and how that actually links into possibly, you know, not the next Microsoft to come out of Cape Town, but definitely, you know, innovative solutions with really good skilled people that they want to, you know, also work in the region. I think there hasn't been a very good methodology around this, or many good examples that are not linked to very developed countries in this, or more cyber mature. And there is an opportunity there for those especially working in international development to really look how, aside from the traditional capacity building that we see, you know, more on national cybersecurity strategies, incidents capacities and the like, to link that with the local universities and expertise in startups and the like, to create local cybersecurity economy and local services. But we're not there yet. But I hope some people would be inspired by this and maybe take it forward.
Thank you so much. So we have a question from Natalie, which is actually a question I wanted to ask. So thank you, Natalie. More specifically for Fabrizio, but maybe Hilde will have some reactions as well. So she was wondering how the European Digital Media Observatory is collaborating with social media platform, and have you been able to gain access to data? And if I may expand a little bit that question, because in academia, it's very difficult to access some of the data that would be so relevant for policy making, especially when dealing with fake news, influence operations, but also cyber attacks. It's very difficult to get the data, either because it's sensitive or because there are some data protection, personal data protection issues, or some commercial value, which makes it very difficult to conduct relevant research that can be helpful for relevant policy. So how do we bridge that gap? And in the context of the Media Observatory, have you been able to gain access to some interesting data?
Thank you. I'll take the answer. Maybe then Hilde also would like to complement. Well, first of all, let me just say it is very, very early stages. So it started really literally 2 or 3 weeks ago. So it is too early to tell if there were problems, if there were challenges. What I can tell you is what the observatory is supposed to do, and then we can come back to this in a couple of months, or at least I would welcome you to get in touch with the people responsible for it. What it was supposed to do is to, first of all, mapping of fact-checking organizations in Europe. That is really one of the key goals, and supporting them. Then there is the mapping and coordination of research activities on this information. There is the building of a portal to provide media practitioners the materials to increase awareness and build resilience on this information. And then there is indeed design of a framework to ensure access to the platform's data. And for academic researchers to better understand this information. And again, I suppose we will be able to tell you more about this when we get into the project. And the fifth goal is to support public authorities in the monitoring of policies put in place by platforms to limit disinformation. So this is the remit. It started 2 weeks ago, and there will be a second phase kicking off next year. But indeed, to be continued. I hope it provides an idea of what the observatory is supposed to do.
Thank you. Hilde, would you like to follow up? Hilde? Oh, we can't hear you.
Ruhiya was saying that it's sometimes difficult to communicate with partners in the Global South, but I'm sitting very closely to Brussels, and I was just kicked out of the meeting for like 10 minutes, so I am not fully up to speed on what you have been discussing. I saw a question coming in through the chat box, and maybe I could also go very briefly back to one of the points that was discussed in the very beginning of the meeting, that is, how do we overcome the gap between the different communities? So as Fabrizio already mentioned, we try to serve the role as an enabler, for instance, through the type of platform that we have set up in the context of this project. But I think what is also very important to bear in mind when you speak about the European Commission is this, the way in which the Commission is constructed. It's a college. It brings together people with very different responsibilities, and the college has the obligation to always find a way forward, a solution that can be supported by all the members of the college. We have a commissioner for digital issues, we have a commissioner for fundamental rights, there is one who looks at industry, there's one who looks at sustainability, there's one who looks at research, and so on and so forth. So the way in which our institution is set up really obliges to bring different points of view together and to reach out to different types of stakeholders. to ask how we work in different parts of the world to try and contribute to this objective of a geopolitical commission. I will not go one of them, but we also work on trade, we also work on energy, environment, and so on and so forth. We try but from a partnership, I would say in a positive way, influence the way in which these countries make decisions and develop their policies. From the perspective that the European Union, as one of the key actors supporting the multilateral rules-based global order, tries to work for win-win solutions for global challenges. And I would say the way in which we design the cyber world, the digital world is part of that. So I hope that there I've been able to bring some relevant input to the things that have been discussed and to the questions that were raised. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. So we couldn't hear you for a while, so I hope other people could hear you better than I did. We have another question for everybody, I guess, which is what is the role of non-governmental organizations and human rights activists in the digital domain to close the knowledge gap? Who would like to start? Fabrizio?
Yeah, I can take it. Of course, it's a very broad question and a very general one, so it's not the easiest. But I mean, to me, is to put it in very blunt and general terms, it is about bringing some of the more contentious issues to the court of public opinion, as well as to the attention of policymakers, in ways that no other of the players we are discussing could probably do. And that, of course, can be done. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, one of the celebrities that Nayia hosts in Davos is also a civil society organization, if he or she does this particular function. But again, the point is to speak truth to power, and to speak truth to power in this particular domain can mean both governments, but also, of course, the platforms, and that's perhaps not so obvious these days. Yeah.
Indeed, and we do have quite a few leaders from civil society and NGOs, both from the digital domain, but more broadly. And I think it's precisely serving that purpose that Fabrizio just outlined, because there is no other, I think it's like the stool, you have the four, if you don't have four legs in a chair, it will fall. So you need to have government, industry, academia, and civil society. And I think they're a critical part for putting to the fore some of the concerns and help shape better policy making.
Thank you very much. So I have one last question, and I guess it's even broader, but I'm interested in your take because we've seen that during the COVID-19 crisis, the digital solutions were kind of the bedrock of the resilience of our societies. And I just wonder how this crisis is likely to impact representations of cyber stability, the process of cyber diplomacy, and how it's likely to, according to you, shift priorities of the different set of actors that engage in these discussions. And maybe just to follow up on this, we've started discussing with some of the private sector actors who were interested in doing joint partnerships, but now there's just so much uncertainty that their top priority has shifted to other areas, whereas at the same time, they really depend on networks in order to continue their activities. So how is this sort of reorganizing the landscape and the discussions?
Indeed, maybe a very quick 2 cents on my end. I think as the forum does the global risk report, we had an update on the COVID outlook, post-COVID, let's say. And I think clearly there is one key aspect that we might forget, those that we are in a cyber bubble, is that we have companies basically struggling for existence right now in many cases. So on that side, on the private sector, I think cybersecurity as a policy might not be the top priority on the one hand, and on the other hand, we have a lot of pressure on like having accountability and proper cybersecurity without giving up privacy and rule of law concerns, as we are seeing so the COVID apps, different models popping up in different countries and regions. And I think what it will help maybe accelerate will be more openness in discussion, but more in a longer time frame. So I think that now you don't have to travel anywhere to be in conferences and like that. So that actually is an opportunity for opening up to more constituents and having a more democratized, I would say, discourse. But it might take longer.
Thank you.
From my part, just very quickly, again, it's a very broad question, but it is, I guess, apparent to all of us that the crisis, no matter how much of it will remain in our lives, has, in some respect, accelerated certain trends and appended others. We are actually just doing for the World Economic Forum, one of your colleagues, Nayia, one of these transformation maps on the European Union. And clearly, we didn't think about this before COVID, but now this is going to change a little bit the way we are going to look at it. It's inevitable. So my sense is that as much as this has affected very much our personal lives, we are going to see in all of these domains, whether it is cyber diplomacy or whether it is the fight for fake news, indeed, an acceleration on the side of certain trends that we saw prior to COVID. And perhaps there will be an element of hybridity in the way we tackle them, because clearly, even when we will be back to some kind of normality, some of these habits, whether they are personal or at the level of exchanges or in the way we order goods that we have acquired over the past couple of months, I think they're going to remain, and so we're going to keep with this as a staple of our lives. Yeah.
I'll just jump in briefly. Just not to kind of keep this drum, but with half the world's population not able to access the internet, I think that COVID-19 has done more than anything to highlight the severe digital inequality in the world. So a lot of informal businesses who could actually potentially benefit from digitalization were not able to because they don't access it. So I feel like sometimes we live in a little bit of a bubble and we don't realize how difficult it is for people to benefit really from these systems when they can't actually access. And it's much more challenging in sub-Saharan Africa. So, and actually IDRC did a big call on COVID, around COVID-19, around think tanks and also around AI innovation. So we're grappling with these challenges. Thanks.
So at least it participated in minding the gap, as Fabrizio was saying. Hilde, would you like to have a final word?
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me now.
Yes.
I think we don't need many words to bring it together. Acceleration, an enormous acceleration and an enormous awareness raising of the inequalities, as Ruhiya said, but also about the principles, rule of law and human rights that need to underlie any further rolling out of this. So in a way, I think that the saying "never waste a good crisis" is one that is very, very much applicable to what we are seeing now. Many lessons to be learned and a lot of practical work to follow up. And the Commission is definitely committed to doing that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And we'll just wrap it up here. So you can get a round of applause, but you'll get my applause. Thank you very much. And enjoy the rest of the conference.